Today's guest is Dr. David Drake. He is the CEO of the Moment Institute and has been a pioneer in the coaching space for over 25 years, devoting his life to studying the art and science of change. He is the founder of narrative coaching and integrative development, which is the space our paths crossed. David is one of my teachers and mentors. In this episode, Dr. Drake and I talk about identity. He describes identity as the intersection of how we see ourselves and how others see us, which allows us a felt sense of coherence. If you Google identity, it might come up with the description of it is a set of qualities, beliefs, personality traits, appearance, and/or expressions that characterize a person. We don't often give our identity much thought, unless, of course, someone asked us to introduce ourselves at a cocktail party. I don't know about you, but my answer is usually wrapped around the roles that I play. I am blah, blah, blah. Well, during this conversation, Dr. Drake teaches us there is no singular identity. We are a feast of selves, and we can begin to notice how we are rising in the moment. And we can begin to learn to discern if those attributes of our identity are in service of who and what we are now, or who and what we want to become. Life becomes more fluid and present when we can sift what is true in the moment. Without this awareness, there is a danger in over-identifying with parts of our identity that no longer serve us. And this is what often keeps us stuck. So the invitation here is to invoke a sense of curiosity. Who am I anyway? May this podcast be a catalyst for you to become the better version of you, just bursting to step forward. You're listening to the Investment of Self podcast, where we uncover ways to reduce dis-ease and live authentically. Welcome. I am Kathy Washburn, your host. I'm a 20-year advanced stage cancer survivor who only recently realized the importance of investing in myself. I created this podcast to connect the work and research of knowledge experts directly to you, the humans their work can help. Hello, David Drake. Welcome, welcome. It's so good to have you.
Thank you, Kathy.
I am going to let David introduce himself, but before I do, I want the people listening to know how I know David. David's work has been nothing short of revelatory for me, both personally, or first personally, and then professionally. He's the founder of the Moment Institute, but when I found him, it was mostly the concentration was on narrative coaching, which was just a door that just blew open. And right after that, shortly after that, COVID happened, and he was offering other more immersive programs. And I really think that year, as terrible as it was like the inner greening of my landscape. It was just such a rich program. I went through a couple of them with you as you've grown. So David's work has just really helped me be a better version of myself while discovering so much about myself in a way that was never possible before. I felt like it was only through kind of a therapy or working with a psychologist or a therapist that kind of withheld a lot of what you unlocked because you helped me understand it intellectually. And that was how I had to enter this realm. But enough about me. I want to know a little more about you, what you're doing right now, what you're bringing into the world.
Yeah, so we're practicing sort of what we preach. We're moving away from these big programs to create more of a learning community where there'll be a library of everything I've ever done in one place that people have access to if and how and when they need it. And then plenty of opportunity to practice together, collaborate together to kind of bring new things to the world, which is really interesting to me right now. As part of that, doing a lot of work with this new piece on the 5 maturities, like how do we help ourselves grow in some new ways and think about learning and development. And then I've got an opportunity with Ovida, which is one of my clients. It's an AI-based platform that, and we're now moving to integrate ID into that to, again, help organizations and coaches and whatnot be more agentic and in their own self-directed learning. And so that's an exciting frontier. And I always like the kind of new ways to think about or apply my work. And I think what's become really clear to me, because I'm in the middle of sort of trying to sense kind of an umbrella term for the new website. And when I reflect back to my life, I've never quite easily fit in wherever I go. And so, but rather than kind of like bang on that door, I just go over here and create something else that I think makes more sense to me, works better for me, and seems more in line with what I believe. And so I think ultimately what this all is leading to is that realization that in every aspect of our life, no one has a singular identity, which I know is our topic for today, or a singular role. So like you look at now, teachers in many schools spend hardly any time actually teaching. They're servicing all the requirements of them around assessments and all the bureaucracies and all that. Many of them are now, many schools are now as much into social work as education because a lot of children are coming to school in need. You think about, my therapist. So when my daughter was in therapy for a while, I taught some basic narrative coaching to her therapist because I knew something that would work really well for my daughter that a typical therapist would not think to do because it's outside of therapy. And then, I've stopped even answering the question when people challenge me about narrative coaching. Well, that sounds like therapy. And I'm like, yes, and your point is what? Because I feel like we just need new types of practitioners who can morph ourselves within, boundaries to help people get what they need when they need it, to be able to move forward in whatever that means for them at that time. And so a lot of what we do has very much to do with identity and how we see ourselves and the roles we play and the freedom we need to feel like we can embody to serve humans in their greatest need.
Wow. And that is and has been my experience with your work. You're such a pioneer. And I've now responded when people say, well, are you a therapist? It sounds like what you do is therapy. And my response is now, what I do is therapeutic. But I'm
excellent. I've heard that before somewhere.
Yeah. I think I might have got it from Dr. David Drake himself. Yes. And I never really felt like I could step into that because of imposter syndrome or, whatever other things that would make me believe like, oh, I'm not as worthy as a therapist, but all of the mindfulness, the work that I've done with you in ID, learning about shadow and attachment theory, diving deeper into those things. I think what I do is therapeutic. And I'm happy. I'm so happy and overjoyed to be able to carry your torch.
Thank you.
Some way.
I'm glad.
And I'm super excited to talk to you about identity. This is one of the things with a type C, a person that aligns with type C coping. They tend to lose themselves. A lot of clients come to me lost. They say, I feel lost. And it was actually during one of your, I don't remember what program, when I learned this quote from Stephen Jenkinson that you brought up. Being lost doesn't actually mean you're not where you wished you were. Or being lost means you're not where you wish you were. It doesn't mean you don't know where you are. It means you wished you weren't there. And I don't know why that was so profound to me. And so when clients come to me and say, I just feel lost. I don't know who I am anymore. And it's behind all those cloaks. So the more I can do to help them find that sense of self
Mm,
in the midst of conflict, the better I think they are
yeah,
internally and externally. So we're going to dive into this. It's a
excellent.
topic, but the first question I'm going to ask you is, what is identity?
Well, it's easy, or probably just to describe some attributes. So it's this sort of the intersection of how we see ourselves and how others see us. So we don't form them only on our own, but in response to others from early in life. So I look at it sort of as the overall sense we have of ourself and something that allows us to have a felt sense of coherence and meaning and purpose, but also has the ability to adapt. And to what you were saying earlier, I think one of the ways we get ourselves in trouble is we assume there's a singular identity and there's someplace else I should be or some other person I should be that I'm not, therefore I'm nothing. And so being lost is an identity, right? If you're deep in grief, so my favorite aunt, my old mom's older sister, just passed away a couple of days ago at 91, I think. And so people are in various forms of grieving, but if you're in deep grief about something, that is not that's not the totality of your identity, but that part of you kind of rises to that moment and you can feel not like yourself. Or, I've had something in the vicinity of COVID for a year and a half now. I don't know, that isn't all of me, but it profoundly shaped how I saw myself, what I could do or not do. Um, but I was wise enough not to be consumed by it and over-identify. That's who I am now.
Mm.
And to kind of rally other parts of myself to come. So it's just sort of a coherent sense of the narrative we hold about ourselves, which is shaped in response to others. And there's, I think, elements of that remain consistent over our life. So I'm helping some friends of mine plan a high school reunion, and many of them they have the same characteristics that they did 50 years ago, and certain things have changed about them. But there's some core pieces that you can recognize.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love this idea of that part of yourself rising to the moment,
Yeah,
uh, and really allowing that to happen without deflecting,
yeah,
or over identifying with any one part that rises.
yeah. And I think of identity sort of as a community. It's a feast of selves, and I was sharing with you before we got on the air here about getting ready to move to Amsterdam. So we have the self that's been in Amsterdam many, many times over the last 10 years, who feels quite happy and at home there. There's the self in me that wanted to move to Amsterdam, but the timing was never quite right. There's the self of me that made the commitment to do that. There's the self of me that showed up differently to my relationship there, so that as she was doing her work to welcome me to Amsterdam, there's the self in me that's planning to move to Amsterdam. There's the self in me that's going to arrive in Amsterdam, which is not the self I am now. It doesn't mean my fundamental identity changed, but all these selves have a lens on or perspective on my present experience.
Mm.
And so, like, the part of me that anticipated and really wanted to move to Europe several years ago, that part of David got frustrated. Why can't I have this now? And well, it wasn't ready because there was a whole bunch of things that we discovered needed to happen first, which we didn't know at the time. And in terms of our own evolution and shifts in our business lives. And so part of it is just, I think, just noticing kind of what parts of ourself are speaking in any moment in time or acting. And is that in service of where we are now, here and now? And recognize that no one of these selves is our entirety of our identity. None of them is David, right? They're just parts of David. And so for me, the David that wanted to be in Amsterdam, say 3 or 4 years ago, wasn't actually ready to be the David that actually moves. And now that I'm moving, I've noticed myself already changing,
Mm,
and in anticipation of what that's going to be like. And so it's just kind of always this locating yourself and this community of selves, and kind of what is that like, and what is that allowing you to see or not see, or feel or not feel, and from which of these selves is the action you want to take going to come.
mm. I love that idea. And you had, I think I took one of your practices and spun it a little to
Uh,
make it my own, but I call it my boardroom, where
mm,
like struggling with something, I do this meditation where I invite all of those pieces
oh yeah.
table, and I really mindfully like, okay, what do you got to say about this? And
Exactly.
it's so strange who shows up. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
12-year-old, and sometimes she's nowhere at the table, and it's my
Yeah.
24-year-old or yesterday.
Well, and for me, the value of doing those kind of practices is that many of us, we look back at our life at regrets. It's often when we tuned out certain parts of ourself and overemphasized others. So if I had tried to force the issue to try to move 3 or 4 years ago, it probably would have been fine, but nowhere near what it's going to be now. And
Mm.
so part of this is just checking in with ourselves of, like sometimes we get really excited by something, or enthusiastic or seduced or whatever. And we go, oh, and we lean into that, and we put too many eggs in that basket. And we realize in the end, oh, that actually blinded me to some things I didn't see. And so I feel like what you find in thinking about identity this way is life becomes much more fluid and present, where you're always just sort of sifting, what is actually true here and what's actually real for me. And I'm finding now, having done this work for a while, I'm making better choices. I'm avoiding things I would have been, oh, maybe I can make this work. And now I'm like, no, I'm not gonna do that. That David can't be fooled again.
There's so much freedom in that, right?
Yeah, I think
It,
so.
it doesn't
Hmm.
have to be so hard.
I know. I wish
And
I'd figured it. Yeah.
yeah, and the idea of starting with self, because you
Mm,
mentioned that the self, there's also an influence on your identity from the outside.
mhm.
And that importance in really being able to have that strong back in who you are and who you know to be, and then shifting the perspective to how society and culture and other stories, maybe even ancestral, how that shapes an identity.
Yeah.
But that individual work is the first step,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and I know in what you sent me, you talked a lot about sometimes people in the spaces you're working in get so caught up in the other they forget themselves. And I know that the guy that wrote a lot about mentalization, the ability to empathize and imagine what something is like for somebody else. I always thought we should have self-mentalization. Can we even imagine ourselves? And
Mm,
do we consider that with as much depth as sometimes we get caught up doing for others?
right. That that might just be a practice I invite clients and
Yeah.
myself to do. As a type C, I grew up believing that my validation came from the outside.
Mm,
So that mentalization, that over empathetic, almost a spidey sense. I remember when I was younger and
mm.
I could see the tone of my mom, and my sister would poke her, and I would think, can't you see this train coming? It's coming. Head down.
Yeah.
I never understood why I had this almost secret vision, and I could adapt myself where she just hit the train full on
Yeah.
without that
Yeah.
awareness. So to mentalize self and be able to imagine myself in the same way that I consider others
Yeah.
is a practice.
And so then over time, you just start seeing the whole, because you're in your own mentalization. You're not mentalizing them over there. You have, I mean, it's an extraordinary skill to have to be able to do that. Otherwise, it's really hard to be in relationships of any kind. But you're not isolated objects in this diorama. You mentalize so you better understand them, but them is in context with you, right? So you're in that as well. And so, we don't know what your sister was wanting and hoping to gain from poking your mom, right?
Right.
And there was something about her identity or her journey or her psyche that felt like a good thing, an important thing to be doing. I think about my younger brother who used to, my dad was an engineer, a wonderful man. He's now long gone, but he was a big guy, wasn't very expressive. And my brother really needed, I think, a lot more guidance from my dad than he could give and that I needed. So one of his efforts was to just keep poking my dad, which on the outside we could judge in a certain way, but in reality it was his sense of self. I need some things, but I too can't articulate that. And I can't ask for what I really need. And so I'm going to do this and hope that you get the clue and respond, which of course my dad never did, which then upped the ante on the poking. And, so I just think identity, again, is important to understand all of its aspects for us, recognizing it's always in motion and that certain times particularly ones that were very protective of us when we were younger, like you were describing, it's not about letting that go. It's about repurposing it and resizing it so it's there when you need it, how you need it. So, we've all had encounters or even relationships with narcissist personality types. Well, it's not like what they're doing is wrong or bad. That's how they're coping and getting through the world and seeing themselves. And there's some scaled appropriately. There's some great skills in there, learning how to speak up for yourself and stand for and ask for what you want and, go first and get attention. And there's all these strategies we have around our identities have value. It's just that we get locked into them when we sort of cement them into place. And this is who I am and how I have to be and how the world is, therefore. And it just really limits what we can do. And a lot of it's just being willing to let go of or kind of decenter certain parts of ourselves, recognizing we probably don't need them as much as we might have once in the past. I was sharing the story yesterday, a couple of days ago in class, about there was a year when I decided on a whim, just for the fun of it, I took a test and got into MENSA, right? So that, and then a few months later, I was nearly killed in a car accident and hit by a truck, ran a stop sign. And I had a concussion for the better part of 6 months and about a year to recover. So I went from, look how smart I am, to I knew nothing. And that was the best gift ever because I realized two things. Wow, there's whole other ways of living besides thinking. And two, being smart is a nice asset, but it's really not who I really am. And it's not really that important to me anyways. So it just allowed me to put that part of myself to both respect it and take it more seriously, and also respect it and take it less seriously. And so I find it sort of right size in the sort of the pantheon of my identities.
Sometimes these lessons have to be big.
Yes.
Or we ignore them.
Yes. In this case, it was dozens of tons of big. Yes. Yeah.
And one of these, the identity, when we have that sense of self versus when somebody says, oh, who are you? And people say, I'm a mom or I'm a wife or those labels or kind of cloaks that we wear over our identity. Sometimes we think they're chosen for us. I work with a small group that's expanding, which is so interesting, of mid-20 year old women who are changing their careers because the careers that they're in were chosen for them.
Wow.
No, I applaud that they figured that out in their mid-20s and didn't wait till they were 57, like somebody else I know. But it's astonishing
Yeah.
that we create these identities in service of other people, or
Yeah.
because somebody wants us to do that. So that formation of a strong identity is so important. Yet, I think that these shadows or attachment styles, they can often, when we're not aware of them, they keep us stuck in these old places. And
Yeah.
when I was doing this work with you, and this was like one of those things that I just got so much joy in learning more about the shadow and attachments. You have the best slides, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
The best slides and the best quotes, but you had introduced Robert Bly's description of the shadow.
Yeah.
Which, will you explain that to us? Because it was one of those things. I think everybody on the Zoom call had this visual. Wow. Exactly.
Well, his view was that we're all born a 360-degree orb of beauty and beingness, but from day one, unconsciously and somatically, and then more and more consciously, we start to figure out that certain parts of ourselves don't quite work here, or they don't fit, or they're not accepted, or they're not validated or valued, or there's no room for it. You often see siblings like these young women you're working with shift their path because another sibling's already on that path, right?
Mhm.
And so they have to make a space of their own, which could be good, but often means they move away from what they too might love. And so his whole thing was, we end up just like, oh, well, never mind. Oh, just apparently that's not useful here. And then we shove it into this bag thing to survive and to fit in and to get what we need, which is safety and love. And then we spend, sort of like with Jung, we spend the second half of our life, if we want to do the work, unloading that bag and saying, hey, I want some of that back. Because it never goes away. It's hidden from us in shadow, but it has not left. And because we pretend like it's not there, and there's often some shame that goes with it, or blame, or other things, just keep it, sometimes trauma even, or keep it trapped there, but it affects us. And it limits us in ways we often don't appreciate. It holds us back. It means we overfunction in other areas because we have the same needs we need to get met. We keep striving to, this time I'm going to get it right. So all the Imago people would say, we just recreate relationships that would replicate those old events. So this time I'm going to get it right. And this time I'm going to win. And then we don't, because we're stuck in the same thinking. And so the freedom that comes later in life, if we do the work around our identity, is to really be able to almost like pour the bag out on a table, almost like, and to just see, like, what do I think about this now, and what do I want? And I remember years ago when I worked in the church, and there was an older man, his wife had passed away, and they were neighbors of some good friends from the church. And so they called me in the middle of the night and said, can you come out? She's dying. She wants somebody to be with her when she's dying. So I went. And then, but the man, they weren't religious, and the man was really not religious, but he was so grateful that he wanted to come have her funeral at our church. And he said, well, can I bring some things from home and put it on you have that table up front? I saw it one time. Can we put it up there? I said, sure, great. And, and we did some other things for him to really personalize that experience. And it was just, he was so moved by this whole thing. But then the next day I got so much grief from the people in the church that, oh, you put his objects on the altar. No. And I said, that's the exact purpose of an altar, right? This is the perfect use of an altar. which is to put the things that are sacred to him as
Mm.
he's saying goodbye to his wife. And so I think a lot of our identity work is again, like for him, he was spreading the bag of all these things that had been about her and them for like 65 years. I mean, and spreading them out. And then he got to decide what got to go on the tape on the altar, and how he wanted to speak to, and there's really like 4 or 5 things, how he wanted to speak to them and what parts of her he wanted to bring forward out of many. After that many years of being married, he knew her quite well. And so what about that felt important? So he's almost like constellating an identity for her in dying.
Mm.
So that because he wants to really cherish certain pieces to carry with him in his heart as he moved forward with his own life. And so I think that's what many of us are doing is and especially in the second half of our life. And these young women they're good on them. They're getting an early start, saving themselves lots of misery.
Right? That's what I
Yeah.
said. And there's so many practices that you introduced in both the narrative release, the ID program, the narrative coaching, because I don't think it's easy for people to dump that bag out or understand what is sacred. It's almost a deer in the headlights.
Yeah.
You know, what do you desire, or what is sacred to you? And one of the most profound ones for me was it was a map where you invited us to write down all the places that we've lived.
Mm-hmm.
Will you explain that? Because I don't think I'll do a very good job, and having you in front of me is a little intimidating.
I can just like, sorry to be intimidating. That's my intent.
No. That's just because I hold you at such high regard.
No, thank you. So humans are social animals. As much as we like to feel like we're free to just move and we don't, pay a lot of attention, but so we just ask, when I do this physically in a room with like on the old retreats, we would make the globe the floor, and we'd sort of mark out points. I'd have little cards with, here's San Francisco and here's London and here's Beijing or something, so people kind of orient themselves. And then we have people go to the map of the floor and stand where they were born. And I said, we just invite them to feel, what was it like to be born there? And what do you remember about that? And how did that shape who you think you are? And then we give them some time, they take some notes, and then we say, usually I do this like in either 5-year increments, or I just say, what was the next significant move in your life? And then people go. And then, inevitably they all end up in the same place because we're doing a, retreat in a city. But we ask them to, as they're walking from one place to the next, what led you to leave? And as you stand there for as long as you need, and we have people just like bursting into tears. Like, oh, I realized I was only 5, but I loved my house, and they moved. Nobody told me we were moving. And so there's this, all these parts of ourself that got left behind, because but then to feel what it was like to leave and why they left, and then to walk with great intention and consciousness. What are you noticing about your identity and your sense of self and your state as you move? And where's the energy? Is it pulling you back? Is it propelling you forward? Is it wishing you could be over here instead? And then as they get close to wherever they moved next, what's it like to almost arrive? How does it feel to arrive now and stand there? Turn around and look back where you came from. What do you notice? And then people are like, whoa, because again, we're somatic, physical, embodied, social, land-based creatures, right? Have millions of years of heredity in us. And so, of course, we are very sensitive to space if we stop to look. And so we just get people to do that until they arrive where they live now. And for many people, even though they've thought about these different places, to feel themselves moving, and recognize what they left behind, what they gained, what they lost, what changed, decisions they made, decisions that were made for them. And they start to realize all the different things that and experiences that led into how they see themselves now and who they think they are. And what many people, and the last thing I'll say is, look, when many people discover is a move that was more disruptive than they remembered, particularly if it came in an inopportune time in their development or wasn't handled well or didn't end well for them, they realize that oftentimes they've left a lot behind. And there's scar tissue there, and there's things that they've kind of sort of sealed over that are going back to your bag metaphor. I need to bring that city and that house and that relationship or that whatever, and I need to put it on the table, and I need to figure out what I want to do with that now. And it's why, like in our work, we don't set goals very often, because the person who's going to set the goal is not the person who's going to complete the goal. Otherwise, they would have already done that. And you don't really know what something means or is going to be like until you do it. And so, many of us would, there's many, well, I don't know anybody that doesn't have things in their life that they wish hadn't happened.
Mm.
And in the end, to not take away from whatever that cause that was adverse for us, they also become our greatest gifts. Like I think about tragedies and traumas in my life that, I spent so much time being outraged at and ashamed of and all kinds of things, which is, it's fine. It's a human process that we're in. And I don't know that I would be who I am and what I do if I hadn't had that. If I'd followed that one of my first moves took me in a direction that probably would have made a nice life and a good career, and I would be a fraction of who I am now. And it wasn't always easy to get here. There's parts of it, yes, I wish I could do over, but life is what it is. And the bottom line in our work is all of our attention, and my friend Carol and I, we've sort of realized it's all about returning to situate again and again and again, every moment of time. And being cognizant of how we got there, but it's all going back to the beginning again and again. Like, how do I choose to be now? And what am I bringing with me? And what am I not bringing with me? And who gets to play with me and who doesn't? And yeah.
Yes, you're in the revelatory work that you do. That was one of the biggest gifts, is walking away with some grace of all that came before, and really embracing and realizing how that has shaped who I am.
Yeah, and you were one of our early adopters because you went on this massive road trip.
Yes,
to save Western healthcare.
Yes, and what turned out, as my son clearly articulated it from the day one, Mom, that sounds like you're on an Eat, Pray, Love tour. I thought, nailed it. It took me a year to figure that out, but he got it from the very beginning.
Yeah, well, good for him.
Well, a lot of what brings people into this work can sometimes be considered a rite of passage, right?
Yeah.
It's something that either happens to them or is happening with them. Can you talk a little bit about rites of passage and how that's changed kind of over time, and maybe even where coaching might fit in with that?
Yeah, so my first degree was in sociology. Wasn't that useful for a career, but fundamental to what I do now. And I always have this capacity to, with love, look for what's missing. And not as a scarcity thinking or, judging. It's just like I noticed in coaching from day one, people were obsessed by the individual as if their psychology was the only factor in what they were dealing with. And I realized we didn't take into account any of the social dimensions of the social narratives from which they came and the social narratives to which they return. And a lot of, in the beginning, particularly, almost all of coaching was white privileged people. And, thankfully that's different now. And we're starting to see there's many realities and there's many ways of living, there's many perspectives. But the rites of passage was really helpful because it comes out of anthropology and looking at sort of more traditional cultures, Aboriginal and Indigenous cultures in particular, but even before that in some Western cultures, where they recognized that your identity was very much a function of the collective. And so many religions have some of these traditions, and cultures have these traditions where when like a boy is on the cusp of becoming a man, or girls and women, or in the Mexican culture, they have a tradition around when a girl turns 15, and it's a rite of passage, right? And it's a recognition that you're leaving one role in your community and taking on a new one. But and I was reading about this yesterday about how one of the challenges of growing is that we're constantly we become an expert at being this, and then we have to, bam, that's gone. We have to become a beginner again, right? And so the rites of passage are basically taking you from the outer world in which you are now. I'm a boy, right? All the things about being a boy or a girl. Drop you into a collective experience in the more sacred space, and put you through rituals, through rites, through ordeals, through celebrations, through acknowledgments, whatever, taking away some of the elements of what you left behind, but then reincorporating you back into the community in this new space. And so for me, again, a lot of the work in coaching is that we don't take into account enough of where people came from, because we're told that's therapy, which is garbage to me. And so we don't have any appreciation for what they're leaving. We're just like trying to make something magical happen and then send them off. But even more so, we don't pay enough attention to what they are facing when they go home. So in our model, it's around sustain, and this work I'm doing with Lovita and others, the vast majority of change that actually sticks is done in sustain, not in the coaching session. And the coaching session just catalyzes something or reveals something. In our world of narrative coaching, we experiment with some things, but ultimately they need to take those first steps, just like when you were a child learning how to walk. That's where the real coaching happens. And that's why I created ID, to kind of make that happen. And so we live now in a time when everything is commercialized and everything's monetized and everything's labeled and and so these like embedded cultural iconic processes of rights are just not present as much anymore outside of certain ethnic communities or in certain cultures. And what it means is that we're on this endless hamster wheel of life, and just going round and around. Then we fall off, but we get not quite sure where to get back on. And we use the image in the class about helping people realize that even though they might be enjoying the horse they're riding, it's on a carousel. It's going in circles. Oh, wow, look at that. And as practitioners, we get caught up in fads and, oh, well, this year the in color is pink, so we're all going to paint our horses pink. So people will choose our carousel. But we're all in carousels. We're all in these sort of states of delusion or illusion or whatever. And part of our job is to free the horses to go run and play with each other and be free. And so the rite of passage for me is creating these, again, the need for new ways of thinking about and describing ourselves as practitioners who can be in a sacred space with people, see what shows up, see what they're actually ready for, see what they actually need, and bring that into the mix. And for me, that's very much a crucible, very much like in a rite of passage, so that people have some scaffolding coming in, scaffolding while they're processing, and scaffolding while they go back out, and scaffolding to integrate that back into their life. And so all that process can be contained in the work if we free ourselves from, like, you would know this because you're in class, but the most common advice I would give narrative coaches is, please stop coaching, because you're missing most of what's actually happening because you're trying so hard to be a good coach. And that's not really what the person's looking for. And that's not what seems to be happening. And if you were just to relax a bit and not worried about so much yourself, you might actually see what they actually need from this moment in time, which is probably not coaching.
It's been such a paradigm shift for me, your work. And it was immediate. I think you invited us to practice on current clients. And I just remember feeling like, wow, I feel really guilty that I've been monopolizing this person's time and ability, when really for them to have that internalization, what's happening inside, and just kind of throw it up and be seen and heard in a sacred space. And even just speaking the words that they spoke so that they can hear it in their own ears. And then that was the breakthrough, that they could then go out and try to externalize it in some way. And then practice, like, okay, how are we going to do that out here? You have this beautiful, and again, your slides and your imagery, they just get super sticky. You have this Mobius, Mobius strip, which made so much sense to me, because the left-hand side is that capability of ourselves, like this identity, and the stories that we're telling ourselves. And then you start going out into the world and how that changes. And if that's scary, or if you get shut down, you come back over to the left and you're smaller. But if you can experience it and that's a little bigger, then you come back a little bigger. It's this beautiful imagery of what's possible when you're in a place, when you're actually going through a rite of passage and somebody's holding that sacred space for you, which as you said, those places don't occur anymore. We just stay on the merry-go-round and keep spinning, wanting to run free, but having no idea how to undo ourselves.
But and what comes up for me and what you're saying, what I was hearing is, in many ways, our primary role is to serve as a loving mirror. And a loving mirror to see, can this person see themselves? And if not, that's our first order, to help them see and hear themselves. Well, now that you see yourself, what do you notice about that? And what would you like to do about that? And but so much is just witnessing what's happening for them kind of right in front of us. And so much of it is that we don't have any safe places to practice or to try things out. And I think, even it's like a simple grievance from rightful grievance from many women, of men who get caught up in mansplaining all the time. But if you don't know how else to be in the world, right? And you don't mean necessarily to do that, but that's how you just are. That's who you think you are and how men are supposed to be. And you're not even aware you're even doing it. Or even if you are, like, what's the point? Of course, well, I'm being helpful, right? But then if they go out and like try to speak to that in a workshop, then they get shut down. And again, rightfully so, but they're not mature enough to hear that yet. So then they kind of retreat, and so then we're just mirroring them the whole way. Like, I noticed that you pulled way back. So what's happening now? Well, I feel judged. Now, can you imagine how others might feel about that? And so, no. Oh, great. So you're just like moving the mirror around. What can they see now, or experience now, or experiment with now in a safe place to actually? Because, for example, if you just said to them, stop mansplaining, and even if somebody said, yes, I will do that, then they're sitting in the meeting like, well, what am I supposed to do now? That's all I know how to do. Or that's how I got my validation, or that's how my identity was affirmed, or I felt good about myself because I was really smart and I was being helpful. And so then going all the way back to Robert Bly's bag. So what else is in your bag that's hidden because you're so busy mansplaining everything? And well, what if you didn't have to mansplain? And so then we would create experiences for them. So I want you to sit in this conversation for 5 minutes and not say anything and just listen. And you watch them fidgeting, and oh my God, great. So your addiction to mansplaining is just really a function of your discomfort because you don't know what else to do. And you're worried that you won't have any value and people will overlook you. And so great. So now imagine how some people who are mansplained might feel. Oh crap, they probably feel the same way. So everybody's now in this system where nobody's really very, happy or fulfilled. And so the Mobius, the developmental threshold zone is really just trying to expand the capacity to be aware of yourself, aware of how you're showing up. What are you willing to try in that space? Coming back and reflecting on that, what does that say about yourself? And like you said, how did myself get bigger? Oh, like, what if I could just be a man and just sit there and listen? Well, and then they hyperventilate. What do you notice about that? Well, it was better, but then I was self-conscious. So then I pulled, right. So now how would you have to grow yourself to not hyperventilate? Well, and so then you could just sort of see this growing, and then we're just following them. What do they need next? An awareness of themselves, awareness of their action, to get to a place where they're may not always be ridden of mansplaining, but they become aware of it as it's happening.
Yeah, and I love this idea of the Mobius because it speaks to what you said at the very beginning. It's our identity is always in motion. It's not this fixed thing, and it's this internalization, externalization, it has to move. When you hold it in place, it just feels icky when you're frozen in that version.
Well, I was telling the 5-year-old skier story in class this week. And,
I love that one. Isn't that a favorite?
It is my favorite slide, I think, of that. But I was just sharing the story about a friend from way back earlier in my life who had never skied and went skiing for 3 days and when I asked him what it was like to learn how to ski and do it for the first time, he said, it was great. I never fell down. And I said, well, that's not the point of skiing, really. But I said to the class, I said, the reality is that he learned how not to fall down. He did not learn how to ski. But that was important to him. His identity was one, I can't make mistakes. His father was a very well-known commander of a very large military base. And so there was no room growing up in his identity. His bag was crammed full of tremendous fear of making mistakes. So of course, the last thing he wants to do on a ski slope is make in his view, a mistake, even though the only way to learn is to make mistakes. And so I tried a number of times to get him to he would just get into like a death grip snowplow and just go down the hill. And he never fell, but he also never skied. And this skiing story has played out in a number of ways in my life. I did not learn how to ski as a 5-year-old, where you just flowed with the go. Yeah. And
when I came to Vermont, I met up with a woman, Miranda, who I met in your program.
Yes.
And she convinced me to take skiing lessons at this little hill called the Dartmouth Skiway. And I got into the group and, they had us do a couple of things. And the guy said to me, oh, no, you go with that group. You're fine. You can go. And I said, no, I don't want to go with that group. I want to start from the beginning. I want to relearn as if I've never learned before.
Yeah.
And he kind of looked at me funny. And I said, I know how to stand on skis and get to the bottom of a hill. I want to actually enjoy skiing. So I want to be a 5-year-old. And
excellent.
He did not know what to do with me. Everything that he did, he kept looking at me and he said, you really should be with the other group. The next week I go up, he's not there. There's this older man. And again, they start splitting us up and he sends me. And I said, I'm not going in that group. Yeah. I really want to learn how to ski. And he said, oh, actually, you want to unlearn.
Yes.
Learn. And I said, yes, that's exactly what I want to do. And he took me from the very beginning.
Oh, wow.
It was so extraordinary. And then he disappeared and I kept getting thrown into this group. And then finally I said, I'm going to do cross country. But I was such a stressed
Yeah.
skier. I did not enjoy 1 second of it. And both of my sons were competitive snowboarders. I wanted to ski. I
Yeah.
wanted to be with them. But learning to professionally snowplow, you know, makes my whole body was just, if I did fall, I think I would have broke everything because I was so rigid.
Yeah. When you think about like in training and organizations, so people are at work, they're bringing their professional identities to the workshop, which includes, I don't want to look bad in front of my peers. I want to get promoted. So I got to show off and look good to my boss. I've got to just do this well. But they sort of play training. But so they don't really expose their actual self for the most part. The part like you, I want to go back to the core and start from the beginning, and I want to be changed by this so I can enjoy skiing. Well, people and companies can't take that risk mostly. It's too politically liable for them. And then secondly, even if they did, then they've got to go back to the same workplace and be a different person. But all the narratives that are coming at them the minute they leave that room are all about expecting them to be their old self. So there might be a little bit of uptick for a while from a training, but then mostly it kind of dies back down again because they're not actually bringing it's like we want to send all of our trainees into that other group you didn't want to go to with the pretension that we actually know how to do some of these things, right? You want to go back to as needs to happen to make big changes. We need to go back to that 5-year-old self who's raw and more open to learn or unlearn. Yeah.
That's another quote that I always attribute to you. I know it wasn't your original quote. I think it was somebody in worked for GM or something, but it's really hard. GE, yeah.
Yeah.
Really hard to be a changed person in an unchanged environment.
Yeah.
So how do you make your trainings different?
So when I have a client who's courageous enough to use ID, we don't teach them hardly anything in programs. We tend to work on actual actions, activities, decisions that are part of their daily job, and they work on them together. And we basically teach them a lot of mindfulness, awareness skills. Like, what do you notice about the process you guys created for yourself? What do you know about the people that you serve? What do you notice about yourself and each other? And then most importantly, what would have to be different for you to be at your best more often? And so people are co-creating their environment while they're developing themselves. And so if we ever do training of any kind, it's when they've decided they need this, but they're now well down the road of working on something. Our first response is, what do you already know about this? And if they actually know more than they realize they know, they just don't have the courage to use it yet. Who else around you is really good at this? And then if worse comes to worse, I can teach them something, but that's always the last resort for me because I want them to create a learning community for themselves. But what we find is that in most organizations, in the end, on these bigger projects, maybe half the people involved can do this. The rest are like their first ski instructor. They play like they're getting this, but or they don't play at all because they want to be told what to do. They want to just play workshop as opposed to actually doing the real work on themselves and with each other. And so I was on a call right before this, I was sharing really my fundamental mission now is to create new categories of practitioners who can help people get what they need in real time and have status, recognition, naming for that so that clients know how to hire us. Right now, those of us who are pioneers like yourself or myself and others, we can go by virtue of who we are, but it's hard to make our way into other environments that are not quite ready for that. But ultimately, if we're going to survive as a species and as a planet, we've got to find better ways to develop ourselves. And we don't need that we need to be we need to have a lot more of those beginner ski schools. Yeah. Where we're allowed to be 5 and make lots of mistakes and fall down a lot. And recognize that's an essential, integral part of learning and growth. And there are no mistakes. There's just outcomes we don't like.
that have teaching,
Yeah,
those
exactly.
moments.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think you do so well is, there's so much, and I know you're a doctor and scientist and researcher. You have this knowledge that you're able to articulate in a way that is accessible
Yeah.
to those people who are not in the research world. I often say I give science legs, which I take what you've done and help people access it, because it should be accessible by everybody. For us not to understand, we have a bag of sacred parts.
And that's why my shoulder hurts so much. Now I know what this 50-pound bag I've been dragging around for 40 years, right?
Right. And that was the face. I remember there had to have been 40 people on that call, if there were not more. And every single one of us, I'm looking around at the squares and everybody was just, wow, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And just that broken opening that allows somebody to access something inside of themselves and realize they have some agency to do something about it. Such a gift.
No, thank you. And I'm learning something from this too. We're in the middle of reformatting all of the work into these smaller blocks, and I don't organize them by topic, but I think now after this call, I'm going to organize them by sort of like a message. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm seeing this now as a better way to organize this. So otherwise people may be more prone to go back into old mindset thinking around teaching. And I've got to now learn this content. But if I just put it on message, then, which is what I think I do when I teach, but we can just put all the slides in service of grounding or providing a foundation for that message. So I'm thinking what was coming to mind in this was, the distinction in that one slide between the guy carrying the 80-pound backpack up the hill and the young girl with like the 5-pound knapsack. Those are choices. Pick one.
Right.
Well, they're both available to you, right?
And you'll probably get to the top of the hill eventually, but one will be so much easier to carry.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what you've offered me, just that lightness. And I'm so grateful. Thank you, David. I feel like there needs to be another call scheduled to dive into something else.
But I'd be happy to come back.
I'm so grateful for your work. I always end my podcast with this question, and I did send it to you before. If I were to crush your essence up and put it in pill form, what effect would you have on someone taking that pill?
I go back to a poem my daughter wrote about me once. She just marveled at my kindness. And I'm not always that way. I'm not that evolved yet, but I think the pill would be being kinder to ourselves and therefore being kinder to others.
I've taken that pill.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of other people have, and the circle of influence that you have, I just marvel at. We all learn the same things, but we're all teaching it in different populations. And you have changed so many people's lives. I hope you can see that huge map of your influence. And your ears must ring constantly. I can't even imagine. You must have that. What do they call that tingling in your ear if you have
tinnitus?
Tinnitus.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your work. And thank you so much for your gift of time.
You're most welcome, Kathy. Yeah, and reach out and let's do this again sometime.
Thank you so much for your gift of time and for tuning into the Investment of Self Type C Transformation podcast. Make sure to check out the show notes for this episode at kathywashburn.net/podcast and give us a follow on Instagram. at Kathy Washburn, DOTNET. If you liked this episode, make sure to follow Investment of Self Type C Transformation. And if you feel so moved, I would love a review. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, I wish you well.